Screaming wouldn't help. His throat was already filled with molten sugar. Trapped in a vat of boiling molasses at the Cleveland Molasses Works, Frank Miller remained conscious. As the syrup began to harden like concrete around his body, the 180-degree liquid burned through his flesh while solidifying against every inch of his skin, literally turning him into human candy. For 45 minutes, he experienced both third-degree burns and the crushing pressure of the crystallizing sugar cementing around him. His desperate attempts to move only created new pockets of molten syrup against his skin. Yet on the pain scale crafted from scientific studies, even this horrific industrial accident only rates 95 points. Meanwhile, the most excruciating death imaginable is estimated at 140. Stick around to find out what could hit that maximum mark, but I warn you, viewer discretion is advised. The Byford Dolphin Incident. November 5, 1983, the North Sea churned beneath a steel giant, the Byford Dolphin drilling platform. At 4 a.m., while most of the world slept, 5 men prepared for what they thought would be a routine diving chamber procedure. The chamber itself was a marvel of engineering, a metal tube designed to keep divers alive under crushing oceanic pressures. Inside the chamber, 4 divers had just finished their 8-hour shift in the depths. Their bodies had adjusted to pressure 9 times stronger than the air we breathe, the equivalent of being crushed by 300 feet of seawater. The process of returning to normal pressure would take hours, or at least it should have. Diving supervisor Roy Lucas stood before the massive chamber door, checking his instruments one last time. Behind him, the night shift crew moved through their usual routines, the familiar sounds of the platform creating a false sense of security. The clock read 4:03 a.m. Something about the door's seal caught Roy Lucas at eye, a detail so small, yet in the next few moments it would trigger a catastrophe. The chamber's pressure gauge read steady at 9 atmospheres. Inside, the divers waited patiently, their bodies saturated with compressed gases. Each breath they took contained a carefully calibrated mixture designed to keep them alive at these impossible pressures. Lucas ran his hand along the chamber's door seal, a routine check he performed thousands of times before. The massive clamps that secured the door looked normal at first glance, but they weren't. A fraction of an inch off alignment, a tiny detail that would spell the difference between life and death. Had the chamber been properly lit, had Lucas taken just one more moment to double-check, he might have noticed. But in the murky pre-dawn light, this fatal flaw remained invisible. One of the divers shifted position inside the chamber, sending a small vibration through the metal, causing the already weakened clamp to finally give way. The metal groaned. A whisper of escaping air instantly became a scream of tortured steel. In that split second, as the clamp failed completely, a massive pressure difference between the chamber and the outside world created an explosive decompression. 9 atmospheres of pressure rushed toward a single point, turning the escaping air into a supersonic jet. The force was so intense, it transformed the chamber door into a lethal projectile. But worse than the door itself was the shockwave it created, a wall of compressed air moving at nearly the speed of sound. When this pressure wave hit human flesh, it didn't just impact the body, it passed through it. Organs shattered, blood vessels burst. Tissues that normally saw gentle pressure changes were suddenly subjected to forces found only in the deepest oceans. The blast echoed across the platform. Emergency alarms blared to life, their urgent wailing breaking the pre-dawn silence. The night crew, trained for emergencies but never for something like this, rushed toward the chamber area, not knowing that what they would find would haunt them for the rest of their lives. When investigators finally pieced together what happened in that fraction of time, they discovered that the human body could be torn apart in ways they never imagined possible. The pressure difference had acted like a cosmic meat grinder, subjecting human flesh to forces usually only seen in the depths of the ocean or the vacuum of space. On the pain scale, this incident hits 85 points. Even though the pressure wave turned internal organs to mist, death came faster than nerve signals could reach the brain. The explosive decompression happened at twice the speed of a gunshot. Most victims never knew what hit them. Some might say this makes it one of the most merciful deaths in our list, even though the scene itself was anything but peaceful. The Tokimura Incident, September 30th, 1999. The uranium processing facility in Tokimura, Japan, homed with its usual quiet efficiency. 3 technicians arrived for their morning shift, joking among themselves as they prepared for what seemed like just another day at work. Hisashi Aochi, the youngest of the 3, had no way of knowing these would be his last normal moments. The morning light filtered through the facility's windows as they began their work. The precipitation tank before them looked harmless enough, just another piece of industrial equipment in a facility full of them. But inside that tank, they were about to accidentally create something that would release the same forces found in the heart of a nuclear reactor. At 10:15 a.m., Aochi and his colleagues began mixing the uranium solution. The procedure manual lay unopened on a nearby desk. They'd done this so many times before that checking it seemed unnecessary. Each pour of the solution moved them closer to a threshold they didn't know existed. The liquid swirled in the tank, its innocent appearance masking the deadly dance of atoms taking place within. Aochi stood directly beside the tank, his face reflected in its polished surface. The solution they were mixing grew more dangerous with each passing second. In the corner, radiation detectors sat in dark silence, switched off for maintenance the day before. No one had thought to check if they were operational. No one had imagined they would need them. At 10:35 a.m., Aochi leaned over the tank, checking its contents. A blue flash lit up the room, the telltale sign of a nuclear chain reaction happening just 3 feet from where he stood. The air itself seemed to ignite. 17 sieverts of radiation tore through Ouchie's body, more than twice the amount needed to kill a human being. His cells began to die by the billions. The other technicians stumbled back, their training forgotten in the face of unprecedented horror. Ouchie collapsed, but initially, he could still speak. "I can't see," he gasped. "Something's wrong." Within minutes, the vomiting began. The first sign of acute radiation syndrome, but what was happening inside his body defied anything in medical textbooks. What followed was an 83-day descent into horror that pushed the boundaries of human suffering. Ouchie's DNA literally crumbled. His skin melted away like candle wax. His body lost all ability to fight infection, turning the simplest paper cut into a mortal wound. The radiation had shattered his chromosomes so completely that doctors couldn't even identify them as human anymore. As the weeks progressed, Ouchie's condition deteriorated beyond anything medical science had witnessed. His white blood cell count dropped to nearly zero, leaving him with no immune system. His skin wounds refused to heal, instead weeping fluid constantly. The doctors tried everything: multiple skin grafts, stem cell transplants, and even radical new treatments never before attempted on a human being. But each new procedure only seemed to prolong his suffering. By day 59, Ouchie's heart had stopped 3 times. Each time doctors revived him despite his previous pleas to let him die. His body was being kept alive by machines while his organs failed one by one. On December 21st, 1999, after suffering a final heart attack, Hisashi Ouchie died. The official cause of death was multiple organ failure. His 83-day struggle remains the longest survival time ever recorded for an individual exposed to such extreme radiation levels. On the pain scale, Ouchie's death hits a staggering 130 points. Nobody had ever survived such intense radiation exposure for so long. The human body isn't built to handle 83 days of cells literally dissolving, while the mind stays completely aware. Doctors tried everything, but pain medication couldn't touch this kind of suffering. To this day, it remains the longest documented case of severe radiation exposure survival. The Ebel Shaft mining disaster. February 12, 1983. Deep beneath Nevada's desert surface, the Ebel Shaft gold mine cut through layers of rock that hadn't seen light in millions of years. At 7:15 a.m., maintenance engineer Robert Chen descended to inspect a faulty water pump at the 3,200-foot level. 3 miles of solid rock pressed down above him, but it wasn't the weight of the mountain he needed to fear. It was what that ancient rock had been holding back. The pump had been struggling against rising groundwater for weeks. The pressure readings had been climbing steadily, but in a mine this deep, fluctuations were common. Warning signs that should have raised alarms had become just another set of numbers in the daily logs. At 7:32 a.m., Chen reached the pump station and began his inspection. The gauges showed unusually high pressure in the drainage pipes, far higher than anything he'd seen before. At 7:43 a.m., Chen started the backup pump to relieve the pressure. The sound it made was wrong, a high-pitched whine that echoed through the shaft. Before he could shut it down, the primary pump's housing cracked. A jet of water at 1,200 pounds per square inch burst through the fracture, cutting through Chen's protective gear like it was paper. The pressurized stream was so intense, it severed his arm almost instantly, but the lost limb would soon become the least of his concerns. The initial breach had weakened the surrounding rock face. The ancient aquifer, contained under enormous pressure for millions of years, had found its escape route. The breach widened exponentially, and then something unprecedented occurred. The water, racing through the crack at supersonic speeds, began to heat up. The pressure was so intense that the water itself became a superheated fluid far above its normal boiling point. When it hit the relatively low-pressure environment of the mine's shaft, it instantly vaporized into superheated steam. Chen had now found himself trapped in a chamber that was rapidly becoming a pressure cooker. The physical process that followed defied standard medical classification. The superheated steam, nearly 600 degrees Fahrenheit, didn't simply burn. It began to alter the chemical composition of living tissue. His blood, superheated in his own vessels, expanded with such force that his capillaries exploded. The mine's monitoring system recorded Chen's last radio transmission at 7:47 a.m. His words, barely audible through the roar of escaping steam. The disaster didn't end with Chen. The expanding steam pocket, now growing by thousands of cubic feet per second, raced through the mine's network of tunnels. The temperature and pressure reached levels that warped steel support beams. At 8:15 a.m., the first rescue team entered the shaft. 3 men, James Martinez, Tom Fuller, and David Cohen, descended with emergency breathing apparatus, unaware that standard mining safety equipment was useless against the conditions they were about to encounter. They reached the 2,900-foot level when their temperature gauges suddenly spiked off the scale. The steam barrier hit them without warning. Their equipment readings, automatically transmitted to the surface, showed temperatures exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit before the sensors failed completely. The superheated steam had breached their protective gear in seconds. The same horrific process that had killed Chen now claimed 3 more victims. Their bodies were recovered 3 days later, after the mine had cooled enough to permit recovery operations. The protective suits they'd worn had literally fused to their skin. It took engineers 2 weeks to seal the breach, during which time the ancient aquifer released enough superheated water to fill 20 Olympic swimming pools. The evil shaft incident forced forced the mining industry to completely revise its understanding of high-pressure water systems. Chen's final radio transmission was later used in training programs worldwide, though many consider it too disturbing to play in its entirety. On the pain scale, Chen's death maxes out at 140 points. The superheated steam created something unprecedented, the perfect temperature to transform human tissue while keeping every nerve ending alive and firing. Most high-temperature deaths at least offer the mercy of destroyed pain receptors, but Chen felt everything until his last breath. The mine's rescue team found his suit had literally fused into his flesh. The Therac 25 incident. Between 1985 and 1987, a series of radiation therapy machines began behaving in ways their designers had thought impossible. The Therac 25 was meant to deliver precise, controlled doses of radiation to cancer patients. Instead, it was about to demonstrate how a few lines of computer code could create one of the most painful ways to die ever documented. At 9:30 a.m. on June 3, 1985, Ray Cox entered the treatment room at the East Texas Cancer Center. The procedure was routine, simple radiation therapy for a shoulder tumor. The Ray machine hummed to life as it had countless times before, but something was different. Deep inside its circuits, a software counter had silently rolled over, triggering what technicians would later call the electron acceleration malfunction. The first pulse hit Cox with 100 times the intended dose of radiation. He immediately felt an intense burning sensation, like a blowtorch against his shoulder. He tried to get up to escape the machine, but a second pulse had already been triggered. The beam was now delivering radiation equivalent to getting 10,000 chest x-rays in less than a second. Over the next 4 months, the radiation burns tunneled deeper into Cox's body. The damage spread outward from the point of contact, destroying tissue layer by layer. His shoulder blackened and withered. The flesh literally disintegrated, creating a hole that grew larger each day, exposing bone and internal organs. Doctors were helpless. There was no treatment for radiation burns this severe, this deep. What made Cox's case particularly horrific was that he remained fully conscious and aware as his body deteriorated. The radiation had penetrated so deeply that pain medications were largely ineffective. Cox watched helplessly as the hole in his shoulder grew wider and deeper each day. By month 3, his collarbone was fully exposed, and his arm had begun to paralyze. The tissue death spread to his chest cavity, and eventually, his lungs began to fail. He remained lucid until the very end, experiencing every moment of his body's systematic destruction. Cox finally succumbed on September 9, 1985, when the tissue damage reached his heart. But Cox was just the beginning. The machine claimed 5 more victims: Katie Yarborough, Gloria Jimenez, Veronica Hurt, Claude Stanley, and Alice Gabriel. Each of them endured the same fate, fully conscious as their bodies disintegrated over weeks and months. It wasn't until July 1987, after 2 years of deaths and countless investigations, that engineers finally discovered the fatal flaw: a single line of code that allowed the machine's electron beam to fire in high power mode while safety mechanisms were disabled. By then, 6 people had already suffered one of the most drawn-out and excruciating deaths in medical history. On the pain scale, these deaths hit 120 points. Over months, the victims watched holes appear in their bodies as radiation ate through their flesh. Unlike other radiation cases, they stayed totally conscious through their deterioration. Even modern medicine couldn't do much. When radiation burns go this deep, there's no way to stop the damage. By the time engineers found the software bug, 6 people had already suffered this fate. If you liked this video, subscribe for similar ones, or leave a comment to suggest another.